It's my pleasure to introduce Arend Hintze. Arend has a PhD in developmental genetics, working on C. elegans, which means, you know, he should be working in a C. elegans lab, but in fact, he told me that he only worked on developmental genetics because he needed to learn enough biology so that he could be a computer scientist that could know about biology. He then joined me in my lab at the Keck Graduate Institute as a postdoc and later as a research assistant professor, and has followed me here. And he's going to tell you about work that he has done with a number of collaborators, including me, on understanding the language of thought, using, of course, evolutionary principles. And I'm going to announce the speaker right after him, who is Dave Knoester, who has a PhD in computer science from MSU, and has joined my lab to do precisely, you know, what we're doing, namely trying to evolve complex computational things. And we'll see what he has to talk about. But we'll do it such that, you know, after the first 20 minutes we'll have questions for Arend, and after the next 20 minutes we'll have questions for Dave.
That's okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. When you read the title, Representations, Language of Thought, you'll spot this question mark. That's kind of crucial because I'm not saying representations are the language of thought. This is the question I'm talking about. Okay? This entire project was instantiated or started from Lars Marsteller. And in this very moment that I showed you this image, and you heard my voice, Lars, something extraordinarily interesting happened. And that is, you formed a representation. Because first of all, this is a collection of pixels, right? And you heard the word Lars. And you assume that I'm, of course, talking about the person that's on the right, the male, not the female. And secondly, you trusted me that I actually put an image of Lars there, not an image from some guy from the internet, right? And lastly, you also assume that I take Lars, and that Lars is the guy that is in focus and pointing to or facing towards the camera and not looking away. All this information that you took and you integrated, and Julie already talked about information integration, led to the notion in your brain that you now more or less know more about Lars than you did before. You formed this little concept about Lars. And you used other concepts to get to this conclusion. This phenomenon of having representations is really similar to the Matrix image here. This is not a pipe. That's what the French word say. This is an image of a pipe. There are real pipes out there. There are images of pipes, and they're the thing that you have in your hand about pipes, or about images of pipes. This is a representation. This is what I'm going to talk about. And this idea of representations is as old as the Greeks, and Plato in his allegory of the cave is not really talking about representations, but he's talking about the fact that humans can understand and see the world that is projected as shadows on a wall. They can still understand what's going on. This whole problem connects to this one. There's a real world, and if our senses would be able to perceive the world as is, there would be no problem, because then we would have complete understanding of the things we look at. The problem is that you have this imagined internal world that comes through your senses that is not necessarily correct. It is an image of the world, a representation. So there's this problem between the imagined world and the real world, and this is the grounding problem that arises from this. And the second problem is that the real world might be sort of represented or might exist in instances of things. Like there's a chair in a blue color and I can combine both and then I make a blue color. Just because this is how the world is structured doesn't mean that you have the same structure in your brain. It's not clear whether or not you have a little image of a chair and a little image of blue or something like that. Or if you have some kind of language description, paint a chair blue or something. It's not clear what is in here. So one of the things that you know, the ancient Greeks already thought about the problem is that you have two options. They either solve the problem and then it's boring now, or they didn't. And this is exactly the case. And since they thought about this, many people thought about representations. And there are numerous suggestions or explanations what representations might be. For example, this could be the essence of things. It could be symbolic, sub-symbolic. It could be some form of language or not. It could be grounded or not. And some people even say you don't need representations to make intelligent machines. And we said, okay, maybe we should not add to that list. So we said, let's measure representations, the quantity, how much or how many you have, rather than caring about what they are. So let's be deliberately blind about essence or the symbol of it. Let's just try to get a quantity. This is where Chris Adami comes into place, and there is the real Adami, right? Not on the screen, so another way of illustrating this problem. And one thing is clear. If you talk about measurement for representation, then this thing has to be information in nature. It has to be an information theoretic measurement. Because quite frankly, if it wouldn't be an information theoretic measure, well, then it would be about noise. It can't be. So it must be information theoretic. And we define representation in the following way. You have something in your brain, and there are things in the world, and the world enters your brain through sensors. It's important to take sensors into account, because a mirror, for example, right, while it captures the moment and reflects the moment, is not retaining anything. It's like the sensor of this particular instance, but there's no computation happening in this mirror. So you have to take into account that sensors, so to speak, have to be subtracted from this entire concept. So we end up defining representation as this little triangle here. That is the information that your brain has about the world given your senses. Or if you'd like to write this as a very complicated formula, this is the complicated formula that describes this. Information is non-essential, and so forth. Now, after we define this measure, we have a very, very bad problem, and that is, how can we test this thing? Because if I go and measure representations in my brain or in anybody's brain, well, you can say, yeah, of course, you constructed R as a measure of representations to work in this particular system. And if I go and make another system, well, you could argue, well, you made the system to fit R. So what can we do about this? This is where evolution comes into place. You can take some kind of proto-brain. You can take any proto-brain. You can take a particular one, and you evolve it to perform a particular task. In this case, a task that requires to have representations. And you end up having an adaptive brain. And you correlate that with your measure, because the machine that's unfunctional should have low R, and the machine that's functional should have high R. The brain we evolve, the task we chose is the task described by Van Dartel, which is a temporal-spatial integration task, but it works for this case as well. You have an agent that consists of 6 blocks. And 2 sensors on the right and 2 sensors on the left is the only thing that you can use to perceive the world, and they face upwards. And the only actions that this agent can do is it can go left or right. And this agent has to catch small blocks of size 2 and avoid blocks of size 4. And these blocks are dropped from the top towards this agent. The tricky part is that these blocks move either constantly to the left or constantly to the right. The problem is, this all happens in a 20 by 20 world where you have 20 steps until this block hits the ground. You have to catch or avoid it. And this area is 20 ticks or 20 blocks wide. And when you leave to the right, you enter to the left to avoid it. The problem that this agent has is, because it can only look upwards with these awkward sensors, is that there are only certain states, 8 of them, in which these sensors fire. So for example, if this sensor fires, it means that either a block of size 2 or block of size 8 is above this sensor. If this pattern happens, then these 2 are blocked by, covered by a block, and so forth. So there are only these 8 patterns, and only 3 of them are informative about the size of the block. If this sensor is lit, it means that a size 2 block is above them. If these 2 sensors are lit, it means it's a size 4 block. This one is also indicative for a size 2 block. All other cases don't tell you what size of block it is. And none of the images that this robot sees at any given time tells them the directionality of this object. It has to remember it was coming from the left, it's going to the left. It has to put this into connection with its own actions, and it has to put this in the context of the size of the block. So this little agent has to form some kind of representation, otherwise it cannot solve the task. The brains that we evolve are Markov brains, and we hinted at that at the beginning already. The Markov brain is something that you already more or less know what it is. It's some kind of neural network And it works fairly similar to a computer chip. In a computer chip, you have logic gate. This is, for example, an AND gate where you have only the gate firing if both inputs are present. Okay? We use these logic gates, but we also use fuzzy logic gates. Instead of having deterministic mapping, you can say this gate, while it's some kind of AND gate, only fires 90% of the time that both inputs are on, and otherwise it's off. So you can turn logic gates from deterministic ones to probabilistic ones. The next extension we do to these logic gates is we make them more modular. We say they can have more than 2 inputs, and they can have more than 1 output. And there's basically no restriction to this, but usually we only see 4 to 4. Now, this is how the modules of this brain. But you also have to have some kind of genetic encoding, because without a genetic encoding, you can't evolve this. So what we have is a string of numbers, and the string of numbers have specific indicators that say, this is a start coder, this is where a gene starts. And each of these genes defines one of these gates. So for example, this one defines a 2-in-1 out gate, and gates always connect to nodes, because a gate cannot technically write it to another gate, it has to write it to another gate. And Jeff talked about these nodes, these are bits, zeros and ones, okay? You can have other genes describing other gates, and the entirety of the genome describes exactly one large machine. We have input gates on the left and output gates on the right. These are the sensors and motors, and you have these blue guys. These are hidden states that you need to compute your performance and make your decisions. Later, I'm going to show you the causal diagram where we strip this entire machine off of its gate, and we only show you the nodes. Okay? This is a causal diagram that basically says this node is dependent on the input of 0, this guy is dependent on all these, and so forth. And then we evolve this, and just to recap how evolution works, you have a population of agents, you evaluate fitness, and instead of putting a value in there, I put a height, how fit they are, how well they perform. In our case, we wouldn't use height, we would measure how many correct decisions this thing makes, how many blocks it catches that are smaller, how many blocks it avoids that are big. Once you have the fitness evaluated, you create the next generation from this, by fitness proportional selection, basically saying those blocks that are bigger have a higher likelihood to enter the next generation. Then you apply mutation, and you repeat this until you either find the fittest guy or until you want to stop this thing. This is exactly what we did with these brains. And on the left, you see the fitness plot in blue for Markov brains, and in black, just to compare these with classical artificial networks. And this is just a control for us to see if this little paradigm also works. What you see is that over 10,000 generations, the average performance, because this is a plot average over 200 of these evolutionary runs, goes up to whatever, 0.9. And some of these brains have perfect performance. So first of all, these Markov brains learn to do this task. And we know that this task requires to have representations. So we also measure representation in this environment. We see that indeed representation, our measure of representations correlates with performance in this group. This shows us 2 things. First of all, our measure indeed somehow captures the performance of this thing, and the performance is depending on representations. The second thing is these guys evolve representations. Right? We haven't engineered anything. It's clear that biological systems apparently we use representations as well. We evolve, representations can be evolved as a very fundamental finding. And remember, people said you shouldn't use representations. The other thing is, and this is phi, an older version is the atomic phi. I said that we integrate information in the beginning, right? And these guys also integrate temporal and spatial patterns into their performance. And you see that indeed also the ability to integrate information increases over time, over evolutionary time course. But we can do more than correlate these things to our measures. We can actually try to functionally decompose these brains. This is one of the perfect brains that has 100% performance. It catches all the small ones and all the big ones under all possible conditions. And as I said, this is the causal diagram, and it doesn't matter if I show you the gate diagram. This looks complicated. And me looking at this doesn't help, it doesn't make it better. I can't tell you what this thing does, how it really works, I just know it works perfectly. I can go down and really find out what all the gates in this brain do, and I can write down the logic table of these things. Well, this is the perfect functional description of this brain, and it's still not helping. This is why we call this thing epistemically opaque, meaning it's not transparent enough to be understood. So, while we measure representations emerge in the system, we still don't know how they come about. Interesting fact. But we can do one thing more. I said that representations is about the knowledge that the brain has about the world. And I can start decomposing the world into subcomponents, as I can decompose the brain into subcomponents. The brain is made up of nodes here, and the world is made up of concepts, so to speak. So for example, you can ask whether or not the block will in the next step hit the agent, which is very important, because if it's a big one, you should avoid that situation. You can ask about the position, whether or not the block is to the left or to the right. And in the context with direction, it gives you a better cue about this thing, because the direction means this block is falling to the right or to the left at this moment, or the size, it's a size to a certain full block. And for example, this node 12 here has a lot of information right from the beginning of the evolution over the entire evolutionary trajectory about the fact that this thing will collide. So this node knows a lot about this. At the same time, this node also knows a lot about the position of this object. It doesn't know so much about the directionality, and knows essentially nothing about the size. At the same time, node 5 knows a lot about direction and a lot about size, but not so much about ability and so forth. So we can also take this representation measure and decompose which piece of this brain knows what about its environment. And this is the thing that helps us decompose this epistemically opaque network. Right? Just because I can't say a narrative about it, I can still decompose it using this measure. So the entire scheme of this research goes always the same way. You take your proto-brain, evolve it against the task. And the task is determined by the cognitive process that you want to investigate. You just set up a task that requires some kind of capability. You evolve it and you know that your agents have this capability. You can ask other things. You can ask about the evolutionary process of parameters. Sometimes environments shape or have an extraordinarily important impact on this environment. So you can play around with these environments and learn something about the evolutionary constraints in this. You can also use this as an empirical test bed. I can take these brains and take them apart as a bit, or I can use them in different environments, or pick them apart, or knock them, or whatever you want. And of course, I can learn something about the functionality. And Dave is not talking about applied questions. What I did here is very small, theoretical. What Dave is going to show you is bigger and more applied. So thank you for your attention and all my questions.
Thank you. As Dave is setting up, we have time for a few questions. Please.
I was speaking to nodes. I'm just curious, what was the measure on the y-axis? What was the limit say?
That's bits.
Okay.
Because, yeah. So you have to put this into proportion. The bits number that you saw are around half a bit or 1 bit. That means that they know one thing, like to the left or to the right, or sometimes it's 0.3. So the ability to integrate information in these guys is around 0.3 bits. So it's half a yes, if you want. It's really hard to put this in perspective. But I mean, on the other hand, you can think about what your brain in terms of information integration ability has, and you're looking at probably megabytes of information, or terabytes of information. It's a really hard machine. But keep in mind that this is a really, really small tool system. It's not designed to have lots of information integration.
All right, so we were able to switch up very quickly, so Dave.
Thank you very much. Does everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. Hi, my name is Knoester. I'm a relatively new postdoc in Chris Thomas' lab. And what I'm going to talk to you about today, actually, what I want to do is take a small step back and ask the question, if we could discover a domain-specific machine intelligence, that is, if we could evolve an expert, what kinds of things could we do? And I'm going to illustrate this with one example and run through sort of my thinking as to why we can actually make some traction on this problem. So with that theme in mind, let's begin. First, I'm not going to talk about the roots of intelligent behavior or what consciousness means, or even algorithms that we could use to build intelligent machines necessarily. In fact, I'm not even going to talk about brains or neural networks. What I do want to talk about, however, is this guy right here. For those of you who don't know, this is cancer. Cancer is responsible for 1 in 4 deaths in the U.S. alone. That's 1,500 people a day, give or take. By the year 2020, it's expected that around about 40 million people a year worldwide will die as a result of cancer. And odds are really good that everyone in this room is going to be affected in some way by cancer, either yourself, a loved one, a neighbor, or a colleague. It's a pretty big, scary problem. The economic costs of cancer are similarly staggering. In 2007, it's estimated that the costs associated with cancer approached right around $227 billion, again, in the US alone. So, one of the largest contributing factors to cancer is early detection. The earlier you find out if you have it or not, the odds that you can survive it improve. Now, in a collaboration that we've recently embarked on with the radiology department here at MSU, we are starting to look at the use of evolutionary algorithms to detect and diagnose breast cancer. They have MSU Radiology has a digital database going back 12 years of repeated visits of patients to their facility, tracking whether or not they have cancer, the results of any tests, and database of mammograms and so on. So we're going to be using evolutionary algorithms, specifically the Markov networks that Arend just finished talking about. To illustrate how challenging this problem is, take a look at these two images here. On the left is not cancer. This is in fact a benign mass. On the right, this is cancer. Now, you or I, or anyone untrained in this field, looking at these images would perhaps say, well, there's really nothing here to look at. And indeed, people that have tried this with computational methods in the past still suffer from a very large, on the order of 70% or so, false positive rate, distinguishing malignant cancer from benign mass. What we want to do, however, is evolve Markov networks that provide a digital second opinion to clinicians. Specifically, we're looking for digital second opinions that have a number of different characteristics. We want the decision to be arrived at differently than how a human would determine if an image contains cancer or not. We want the system to provide some measure of whether or not its decision is reliable. That is, if it is not sure about a classification, cancer or not cancer, it should tell us so. It should tell us that, yes, I do not recognize this image. I don't know enough about it to be able to positively identify cancer or not. And of course, we want it to be accurate, but we really only need a reasonable measure of accuracy. It turns out that any second opinion provided to a clinician has roughly the same impact on ultimate diagnosis performance, provided that some minimum level of accuracy is reached. Now, to explain why I think we can make some traction on this problem, I want to take a little diversion into a separate task, one that requires many of the same features as cancer detection, and that is optical character recognition. So these are digitized handwritten numerals drawn from the MNIST database. This is a subset of the National Institute of Standards and Technology's Special Database 19. You might know that this is the database used to assess performance of the optical character recognition machines used for the United States Post Office. The MNIST database itself is a widely used machine learning benchmark for optical character recognition. Now, in brief, the task is to identify the numerals related to these handwritten images here. There's a training set of 60,000 images and a test set of 10,000 images. What that means is that you are allowed to look at these 60,000 training images, run your algorithms, train your neural networks, Markov network. And then once you have discovered a network or algorithm that you think does well, you test it on this separate database of 10,000 images to assess its performance. I should perhaps mention that these individual images are 28 by 28 pixels, grayscale, so there's 784 specific unique pixels per image. Now, the database itself comprises images that were written by a variety of people, among them Census Bureau employees, as well as high school students. So these images here, fairly easy to understand, probably written by our census employees. These are easy. Others are perhaps not so easy. Probably our high schoolers. These images in order, top to bottom, these are 202 and 725. Yes, that's not a mistake. The bottom right image there is a 5. So our goal here is to evolve a Markov network that understands enough about what it means to write an image, that is, perhaps has an internal representation of these images, to be able to detect when someone's handwriting is perhaps a little squirrely. Just very briefly, to evolve a Markov network, we start out with a population of random integer vectors, identify genes within those vectors, and from each gene, we're able to construct a fuzzy logic function. In other words, these functions can be either strictly logic, fuzzy logic, adaptive in some senses. Regardless of the type, however, the entirety of that truth table for a logic gate must be evolved. Notably, they're not limited to your standard logic functions, ands and ors. They can be completely arbitrary. Now, genes don't exist in isolation here. In fact, we have many of the present in the genome construct a Markov network from them, as Arend described. We do have to define the inputs, the number of inputs, number of outputs, and whatever hidden states are involved. I tend to think of what we are evolving here as a logic circuit. So in this particular task, the idea here is that we're taking the pixels from one of these digitized numerals, providing all 784 of those inputs to the Markov network to think about, and then the output from the network itself is then used to interpret the character, the numeral that was recognized. And of course, what we're going to do is track whether or not the network recognized a particular image. So this is our population of Markov networks. We've been using a fitness function that's based on the Shannon mutual information between the known label of an image and the decision or the output from the network. Now, using information in a fitness function means that we are literally discovering the most informative parts of the image. What that means is that we're not limited by human preconceptions in determining what image features might be important. So, for example, while a human might look for sharp corners or curves in a 5 or a 7, for example, these networks are free to look anywhere. And in fact, in practice, what we see is that the parts of the image that are paid attention to are scattered throughout the 784 pixels. So any decision that the network arrives at is done so very differently than what a human being might, or even algorithms that a human might engineer. That was one Markov network. It's part of a population, all of which participate in an evolutionary algorithm, like that shown here with various selection, mutation, recombination, and further fitness evaluation steps. However, once all of this is done, then take the final evolved solution and evaluate it on a separate database of test images, calculate our overall error rate. Now, this is the only plot I have in my talk. This is simply the results on training. So what we're seeing here is the number of bits as information discovered on the training data. And as we see here, it discovers about 3.3 bits of information. This is just shy of all the information from the training data given the 10 possible different ones. Now, when we run one of the best single Markov networks through the testing data, we come up with an error rate of about 53%. That sounds pretty bad. It's actually 5 times better than chance, which is great. But here's the cool part. Evolutionary algorithms are stochastic. That means we can run them in replicate and form a committee of the best Markov networks that we from each replicate. In this case, when we do that, the error rate drops to around about 6%. I should mention this number keeps coming down since 18. Perhaps more importantly, however, is that we can provide a measure of how reliably an image has been identified. This is based on how many of the networks themselves claim to have recognized a given image. Now, in my last few minutes here, I want to highlight a few characteristics for why I think this approach can help us in our task to detect cancer. So, going back to this point about digital cited opinions, what does this approach mean? Well, first of all, it's different. It's different than what a human would do. It's not limited by what a human might engineer, and it does indeed discover the most informative parts of the image as they relate to a classification mechanism. Secondly, the approach is accurate. In committee, Markov networks are reasonably accurate themselves. Further improvements are expected. But most importantly, from my perspective, is that the classification results are reliable. This means we can be explicit about images that aren't recognized or whose recognition isn't strong. In the context of detecting cancer, this is pretty important because what this means is that we can reduce we can present to the clinician how confident the system is in any classification that it produces. Then, as a bonus, once evolved, we can analyze these Markov networks to see what kinds of image features were actually informative. Now, what that means is that we can discover knowledge about cancer itself and feed that information back to clinical practitioners. All right. So, what does all this have to do with a brain institute? Well, evolving Markov networks is just one example that illustrates the synergy between the tools that we use to understand intelligence and building intelligent machines. Just as with the Beacon Center for Evolution in Action, where we have, on one hand, digital evolution that helps us to understand evolutionary biology, we have the same thing going on in Brain Institute. Brain Institute focused on evolution. Use evolutionary tools to understand the brain and further improvements in our understanding of the brain to be fed back to evolutionary tools to help us build machines. Now, if the tools that we need are able to help society by detecting cancer, well, I can think of no better milestone on the path to understanding the brain. With that, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Time for a question or two. Start setting up what we're doing that. Yes.
So in terms of this sort of evolutionary or cycle between how you imagine this sort of the digital and the evolutionary theory and the AI, why are Markov networks in particular do you believe the best suited to this type of starting point? In other words, why start there rather than somewhere else?
It's our belief at the moment that Markov networks are kind of a superset of the possible evolutionary approaches to build these sort of functional networks? It's a very good question.
It's possible to use other.
Oh, absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, in the cancer work that I presented, we proposed to explore different types of evolutionary methods, not simply limited to Markov networks, because honestly, it's not quite, it's applied work, it's not quite clear which